and welcome to Rethink and MHQ's podcast on reintroducing economic substance regulation and what it means for companies in the UAE. I'm joined by our resident expert, Kath Zagatti, to shine some light on why the region has adopted this legislation and what operating companies need to do to be compliant. So Kath, tell me, why has this legislation been introduced?
Thanks for having me today, David. So the Economic Substance Regulations, or ESR, have been introduced in the UAE as part of its commitment as a member of the OECD Inclusive Framework, and also in response to an assessment that was made by the EU Code of Conduct Group in relation to the UAE's tax framework. These regulations were specifically targeted at jurisdictions that offer minimal tax liabilities to businesses, which are also often described as non-cooperative tax jurisdictions. So basically, ESR ensures that entities conducting certain types of business activities, or the so-called relevant activities, are able to demonstrate that they have adequate economic substance in that particular jurisdiction.
Okay, then, well, who needs to comply with ESR?
Well, first of all, one must assess whether or not ESR applies to a particular entity. In a nutshell, entities carrying out one or more relevant activities are captured by ESR and must submit a notification to the authorities. Entities carrying out a relevant activity and also receiving income from such relevant activity must not only submit the notification, but also the so-called economic substance report. This substance report is basically the document that shows to the authorities that the entity has complied with the ESR requirements by having substance in the UAE.
Okay, so can you help me understand what these relevant activities are?
Sure. So the list comprises 9 different relevant activities: banking business, insurance business, investment fund management business, lease finance business, headquarter business, shipping business, holding company business, intellectual property business, and distribution and service center business. It's important to note here, David, that each relevant activity has its own requirements for one to assess whether or not an entity would fall within scope of a particular activity. So some of them are very tricky, so an assessment made by a professional is always the best option to choose.
Okay, well, that really is a comprehensive list of relevant activities. If someone's company falls into one of these categories, what are the substance requirements that the business owner needs to take up?
Yeah. So in order to demonstrate economic substance, an entity needs to review its corporate governance structures and make sure that they comply with ESR, of course. So there are 3 basic ESR requirements. The first is that the entity must be directed and managed in the UAE in relation to the relevant activity that the entity is carrying out. So the entity will have to demonstrate that it holds board meetings with a quorum of directors physically present in the UAE. The second requirement is that the entity must have an adequate number of employees. The entity must also incur operating expenditure and have physical premises for carrying out the relevant activity in the UAE. And the third and last requirement is that the entity's core income generating activity, or SIGAs, are conducted in the UAE.
I see. So what about penalties? What happens if a company within scope fails to notify and report to the relevant authority?
So failure to comply with the ESR requirements or the provision of incomplete or inaccurate information may result in penalties amounting up to 50,000 dirhams during the first reportable financial year. And for any subsequent financial year of non-compliance, the penalties can vary between 50 to 300,000 dirhams. It's also worth noting, David, that the licensing authorities may even suspend, revoke, or deny the renewal of the entity's license in case of non-compliance with ESR.
Okay, so how can we help the UAE business community?
So our team can assist with assessing your business vis-a-vis ESR. So basically, we'll check whether entity falls within scope of ESR. And if so, we will help you understand the ESR requirements, what are the gaps in the entity's corporate governance, if any, what your entity needs to do in order to comply with the requirements. And we will also assist with the filing and submission of the notification and the substance report with the authorities. Last and most importantly is that these assessments should be undertaken on an annual basis, as the circumstances of the entity as well as the ESR requirements themselves may change from time to time.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kath. I appreciate that walkthrough. And then if any of you require any further support on economic substance, please feel free to get in touch with either Kath or myself. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.